Okay, so what you have in front of you is a lifetime concurrent players on Steam for Last Epic. And this is from 2019 all the way to 2022. And as you can see, there's obviously an upward trend and there's more interest being gained for Last Epic. Now, it seems like that there is a hole in the ARPG market that people have been trying to fill for a while now. There's a certain type of player who wants to play an ARPG, but Diablo 3 doesn't exactly cut it for them, and Path of Exile doesn't exactly cut it for them either. And it's not because there's anything inherently wrong with either of these games, it's just that those games don't fulfill a certain need or a certain want or a certain game design philosophy that a big portion of the players in the genre have. And there are games that have come in that have tried to fill this gap. You have games like Vulcan, and you have games like Torchlight that came in and tried to be that. They tried to be the game that kind of meets the middle ground between what Diablo 3 is and how streamlined it is, and what Path of Exile is, and how in depth it is. Now, Last Epoch is, I think, the best contender for the game that can actually come up and meet the demand of these players. And it appears to me that there's a lot of people who have come from Path of Exile and have stopped playing Path of Exile to go play Last Epic. And again, that's not because Path of Exile is a bad game, it's because there are certain things that Last Epic does that better aligns with the needs, wants, and desires of this player base. And there, I've really distilled it down to 5 things, and it's those 5 things that we're going to talk about in this video. And so really the biggest one, I think, the biggest reason why people are moving over from Path of Exile, who are sick of that game, again, not because it's a bad game, is because Path of Exile is balanced around trade. Now, what does that mean? Path of Exile has the majority of their player base playing in trade. Yeah, approximately 90%, although I don't have the exact number. And a much smaller portion, a niche amount of players who play Path of Exile, play in hardcore or play in solo self-found. Okay, so what that means is the drop rates of items, especially good items, is really, really, really low. So low to the point where it's unreasonable that someone who wants to play without trade and who wants to play solo self-found will be able to progress their character very far, or if they do progress their character far, it severely limits the amount of builds that people who play solo self-found are able to play, because they're going to be very, very limited on gear, because GGG sees gear as something that's going to be a team effort to attain. People get gear, maybe you get a piece of gear that doesn't fit best for your build, but you know that it's a piece of gear that would be really good for somebody else's build, and so you then put it up on trade, and then someone buys it on trade, and so then everyone as a team collectively gets gear for everybody else. And because they're balancing the game around that experience, the drop rates are very, very low, and so it makes it hard for solo self-found players to then really progress or really experiment with builds, which actually leads into my next point, number 2, which is Last Epic. Last Epic has lots of build diversity. Whereas in Path of Exile, although the tree is really big and there's a lot of directions you can go in, and there's a lot of variety and customization with the gear, only a small sliver of those combinations can take you all the way and can really get you to push endgame really well and really hard. And that's what players want to do. They want to play games so they could win the game, so they could get far and so they could progress. Last Epic is set up and balanced in such a way where you can experiment with a lot of different types of builds and still make the end game and still enjoy a lot of the end game. And they make it easier to respec and really fit, and there's a wider array of builds that are quote unquote viable, whereas there's a much more narrow amount of builds in Path of Exile that would be considered viable. Okay, so that's a big one. The third reason why some Path of Exile players have now come over to Last Epic is for something that people call QOL, also known as quality of life. Now, this one is kind of controversial. This entails things such as, in Path of Exile, clicking on shards. So, in Path of Exile, you can collect shards, and usually 20 shards of something make a certain gem. So you have to click on it 20 times just to make one gem. And that amount of clicking is something that pisses a lot of people off. You have something like such as auto sort in Last Epic. So hold on. Clicking on shards is in Path of Exile. And auto sort is in Last Epic. And I don't know if it's pronounced Epic or Epoch, to be honest. But either way, when you collect things and you put them in your inventory, you don't have to sit around and play Tetris like you would in Path of Exile. There's a button, you click it, it auto sorts your stuff and makes room for you. You could get on your merry way. That's something that a lot of people like. And it's this sort of quality of life changes that some people who are sick of having to do things that they would consider not even difficult but tedious in Path of Exile, that really attracts them to Last Epic because they've addressed a lot of those things that aren't there in Path of Exile. Okay. So you have quality of life. The fourth reason I've noticed that some Path of Exile players go on and switch over to playing Last Epic or play Last Epic during their downtime in between leagues is simply for the fact that they think that the Path of Exile is too cluttered slash don't know how you died. This is particularly annoying for people who play Path of Exile in hardcore. When you play Path of Exile, the game is notorious for, especially once you get to later in the game, it's notorious for having the problem of the screen being too cluttered. There's too many things going on. It's kind of hard to see where your character is. It's kind of hard to see if you're stepping in something that you shouldn't be stepping on. And this can get you killed. And there are some one-shots that might feel unfair to some people and they didn't see coming. And once you're dead, you're dead. There's no death log telling you how you died. You don't exactly know. And a lot of the fun that comes out of these games comes from figuring out, okay, I died for this reason, or maybe I should have built some more poison resist. Maybe I should have built better, maybe I should have had more armor. Maybe I should have spec'd a bit more into life. These sorts of things. And when you're not getting feedback from the game on what it is that you did that got you killed, it becomes much harder for you to know what to do to then remedy that. And that's where a lot of the fun comes from. It comes from figuring out what went wrong and how can I solve that. In Last Epic, there's a lot more visual clarity, and a lot of boss attacks are choreographed, and so you can kind of see what's going on. And even if you do end up dying, the game will tell you what killed you. It'll be like, okay, you died from poison damage, and that's why you're dead, and now start over. And people really wanted death logs to be in Path of Exile, and GGG addressed this. GGG being the developers of Path of Exile, and they said, you know, we would do this, except we have these technical limitations or whatever, and I don't really understand it because I think there's a death log in the Chinese version, but it is what it is. Okay. And the last big reason that I've noticed that a lot of people switch from playing Path of Exile and go over to Last Epic for this specific group of people is they're sick of the performance. Okay? Performance of PoE. However, this should be followed up with a question mark. And the reason it should be is because Last Epic isn't necessarily known for having really good performance either. Last Epic really slams your GPU at the intro screen, at the login screen, when it really doesn't need to. Last Epic, especially when you're in a big fight with more stuff going on, will freeze your frames, and you'll be running at like 10 frames a second. Now, over time, 11th hour games, the developers of Last Epic have tried to address this, and they've made improvements to performance, and they've made performance better, but there's still a long way for them to go. And here's something else that's really important when you're considering performance. Path of Exile is an always online game. And so that increases complexity at an exponential rate than when you only have a client-side single-player game, because you have things like server load, and you have things like internet connections, and you have things like lag that you're not necessarily dealing with when you're playing a game that's fully client-side like Last Epic is right now, because multiplayer isn't in the game yet at the time of this recording, which is mid-January 2022. And so consider, when Last Epic does get multiplayer, they're going to be dealing with a lot more bullshit in terms of keeping their game performance that they don't have to deal with right now. The game already isn't running at peak performance. They're trying to get it there, and they're making improvements to it with every patch, but it's not there yet. Is that something that once multiplayer comes out, that they will be able to keep up with and continue to keep performant? I don't know. People are fed up with the performance of Path of Exile, move over to Last Epic, but the performance isn't much better here either. And so that's kind of it. There's still a huge player base for Path of Exile, and Path of Exile is a game that Last Epic isn't necessarily trying to compete with. Last Epic is kind of trying to be its own thing and kind of bring in players who don't like specific game design philosophies of Path of Exile, and bring in players who aren't necessarily satisfied with specific game design philosophies that come with Diablo 3, and they want to be their own thing and appeal to a certain niche of the ARPG audience. And they are bringing people in, but whether or not it's going to be something that will stand the test of time is still to be seen. Now, the people who did move over from Path of Exile to Last Epic, just to recap here real quick, do it because they don't like trade in the game. They like playing solo, and they like that they can get everything on their own and they don't have to rely on other people to progress their build. They like the fact that they have a lot of build diversity. Maybe they don't have to look things up as much. They can experiment more, and there's a lot of different ways to get to endgame. People who hate Path of Exile but love Last Epic like that there's more quality of life in Last Epic. There's less things that they would consider tedium, less things to click around on, less things to worry about. People don't like the fact that it's hard to know how you died in Path of Exile, especially people who are hardcore players, and they want to have that feedback so they can kind of tinker with their own builds and figure out what to do. Those are the sorts of people who want to move over to Last Epic and who prefer that game style. And lastly, people are sick of the performance of Path of Exile. Hopefully, the performance of Last Epic can compete with that and be something that over time will be performant. And that's it for this video. If you liked it, like it. You know what to do. Everyone says what to do, and we'll see you in the next one. Peace.